Right now, based on the 2025 HUD point-in-time count, an estimated 1 million Americans are sleeping on the streets, in vehicles, or in temporary shelters. Elected officials point to this fractional 3.3% decrease in homelessness, framing it as a hard-won policy victory. But zooming out on the timeline reveals a structural failure. This dip masks a compounding 27% absolute increase in total homelessness since 2013. When viewed over a full decade, the system is not healing itself. To claim a 3% drop as a victory when the foundational baseline has permanently shifted upward by over a quarter is a statistical sleight of hand. It is like celebrating a leaky concrete dam, spilling slightly less water while the reservoir pressure behind it compounds to a critical high. Mainstream political narratives want the public to believe this pressure comes entirely from individual addiction or psychiatric distress. The mathematical reality points to a different culprit. We are watching a systemic economic fracture. It is quietly and aggressively pushing the working class into the margins through decades of localized supply-side sabotage. By focusing entirely on short-term political victories, the establishment masks the reality that the American housing collapse is an engineered, long-term mathematical certainty. To avoid addressing the underlying economic math, policymakers rely heavily on a highly curated caricature. They focus public attention on the visible extremes on downtown sidewalks, a strategy that shifts the blame entirely away from the housing market and squarely onto individual behavior. The 2025 comprehensive data shatters that stereotype. Homelessness among single individuals reached a record high of over 515,000 people. Within the age brackets, a severe demographic shift is actively underway. While short-term family displacement decreased, homelessness among the 55 and older fixed-income demographic increased by 2%. The crisis is consuming the structurally employed. Grandparents relying on Social Security and full-time warehouse workers forced to sleep in passenger sedans are the invisible new faces of the emergency. Service industry professionals floating between extended-stay motels are part of this exact same symptom, the active cannibalization of the middle class. Displacement is driven by severe rent burden. When 50% of a working-class paycheck is swallowed by shelter, the financial margin of error permanently drops to zero. One grocery inflation spike, car failure, or medical emergency snaps the gauge, triggering immediate eviction. There is no budgeting strategy that can save a household when the cost of basic shelter outpaces the median wage. Eviction under these conditions is a rigid mathematical certainty. If the current societal support system were functioning correctly, the most vulnerable, profoundly disabled citizens would be the first to find long-term stability. The exact opposite is happening on American streets. The highly publicized 11% reduction in short-term family poverty sits in stark contrast to the reality of chronic displacement. In this policy triage funnel, chronic homelessness, long-term displacement compounded by disability, surges outside the system to a historic 155,750 individuals. Policymakers triage easiest short-term cases with vouchers to artificially inflate success metrics, bypassing the hardest cases entirely. The most complex populations are left to languish indefinitely, completely insulated from the billions of taxpayer dollars allegedly spent to save them. Pushing past the humanitarian tragedy reveals a macro-level fiscal destruction playing out at the local municipal level. This continuous fiscal feedback loop charts municipal spending. Repetitive emergency room visits, law enforcement deployments, and sanitation operations unsustainably drain city coffers. Millions meant for infrastructure are vaporized just to manage encampments, causing commercial businesses to flee and tax revenues to plummet. Continuously treating the late-stage symptoms of a housing failure, rather than curing the root cause of unaffordability, creates an economic death spiral, guaranteeing total municipal insolvency. To understand why this continues, we have to look at the paralyzing status quo maintained by the political establishment. Both sides of the aisle are trapped in an expensive loop of managing visual optics rather than actually curing the disease. Recent Supreme Court-backed laws aggressively prioritize the criminalization of encampments. This localized approach simply shuffles human beings across jurisdiction lines, pushing the unhoused out of sight to satisfy frustrated taxpayers. Conversely, the housing-first model is continually suffocated by bureaucratic red tape. It fails entirely to scale against the sheer overwhelming volume of displaced citizens entering the system daily. Both approaches ignore the overarching culprit that local governments desperately want buried: regulatory capture and the deliberate suppression of housing supply. On this standard municipal zoning map, wealthy neighborhood associations weaponize zoning laws to severely restrict high-density housing, capping the number of homes, manufactures permanent scarcity to artificially inflate property values. Blocking apartments saws off the housing ladder's bottom rung, mathematically forcing the working class out. The extreme wealth generated by American real estate over the last 40 years was directly subsidized by the engineered displacement of the working class. The objective resolution to this crisis is a mathematical reality that no current politician wants to acknowledge. The only viable escape route requires a brutal rewrite of the entire American housing market. This model projects two structural pillars. First, aggressive state intervention to forcibly strip local zoning monopolies, mandating the mass development of high-density units. Second, completely decoupling housing policy from the heavily funded psychiatric and medical infrastructure required for the chronically unhoused. The basic housing shortage and the severe chronic care crisis are two entirely separate emergencies. They demand distinct, separate structural frameworks. Executing this dual-pronged solution means actively dismantling all the artificial, government-protected wealth generated by the current housing market. It requires telling the most powerful, reliable voting demographic in the country that their inflated property values can no longer be protected by enforced scarcity. Doing this is viewed as political suicide, so the paralysis continues and the human cost is paid on the pavement. Until leaders are willing to brave the political fatality of disrupting the financial status quo, the structural roots of the emergency will remain untouched, and the math guarantees the system will continue to collapse. This chart tracks a decade of federal homelessness funding on the left axis and the total unhoused population on the right. Both metrics are trending upward in near-perfect synchronization. This growth occurs because the capital deployed to address the crisis has become decoupled from the goal of ending it. Billions of dollars are being used to subsidize an ecosystem that manages the problem rather than resolving it. Displacement in America has become the primary byproduct of a highly profitable shadow economy, a system where the persistence of the crisis is more lucrative than its cure. This machine operates with high efficiency. It converts institutional capital into engineered human outputs. The process begins with the monopolization of the residential housing supply, turning the basic need for shelter into a speculative asset. The internal mechanics utilize algorithmic evictions and a multi-billion-dollar maintenance industry to capture and recirculate federal subsidies. Resolving the crisis requires addressing the institutional forces engineering it. Until the financial incentives for displacement are removed, the streets will continue to fill. Institutional capital is currently absorbing the American housing market at a scale that leaves individual buyers unable to compete. This is the financialization of shelter. Residential housing is no longer a community foundation. It is a high-yield asset class traded by private equity firms seeking predictable long-term returns. In the multifamily sector, the scale of this takeover is massive. Institutional investors now own an estimated 62. By acquiring massive swaths of the residential supply, corporate landlords establish a monopolistic control that allows them to dictate the baseline cost of survival. This supply control traps a generation in a permanent renting cycle where housing costs are detached from local wages and tied instead to institutional profit targets. When shelter is monopolized, the cost of entry is mathematically pushed beyond the reach of the most vulnerable, ensuring a steady rate of forced displacement. Displacement is no longer a localized event handled by individual property owners. It has been automated through algorithmic management. The traditional dynamic of a tenant negotiating with a landlord has been replaced by a rigid, data-driven optimization process that prioritizes yield over occupancy. Corporate landlords use algorithmic pricing software to aggregate neighborhood data, enabling rent collusion that pushes prices to the maximum threshold. When multifamily units are managed by these algorithms, the probability of eviction spikes increases by 30% over a 6-year period. Once a tenant falls behind these automated price hikes, the legal removal process is optimized for speed. It is a streamlined industrial-scale eviction pipeline. This mechanism systematically strips capital from struggling families, transferring it into corporate margins while removing the human friction that once prevented mass displacement. Algorithmic eviction ensures that the flow of newly displaced citizens onto the pavement is mathematically predictable and legally efficient. As the unhoused population grows, the federal government responds with record-breaking capital allocations. For 2026, HUD's homeless assistance funding grew to over $4.4 billion, the highest level of spending in the agency's history. The $4.4 billion is immediately absorbed by surging fair market rents and the high administrative costs of temporary management. Federal subsidies now barely cover the status quo, and no significant capital reaches the production of permanent low-income housing. Instead, the money supports the shelter industrial complex, an ecosystem of temporary facilities that rely on a constant unhoused population to secure their annual budgets. This creates a perverse incentive structure. The organizations funded to manage the crisis have a financial reliance on the crisis continuing at its current scale. A multi-billion-dollar maintenance economy has no financial motivation to permanently house a demographic that secures its annual operating capital. While federal capital maintains the shelters, local governments have shifted toward a strategy of street-level criminalization. The 2024 Supreme Court decision in Johnson-filed Grants Pass gave cities authority to arrest and fine people sleeping outside even without available shelter beds. In response, over 350 cities and 14 states moved rapidly to pass local ordinances criminalizing the act of being unhoused in public. This strategy prioritizes forced disappearance over permanent solutions. Politicians deploy bulldozers to clear encampments, satisfying taxpayer demands for optics without addressing the underlying economic deficit. The legal trap begins with an unpaid citation. A person sleeping on a park bench is hit with a fine they cannot pay. That unpaid fine triggers a bench warrant leading directly to arrest and incarceration. This process transfers the public tax burden from urban housing development into the prison industrial complex, where the unhoused become a source of state-subsidized revenue. Once an individual has a criminal record for trespassing or public camping, they face the final stage of the pipeline. Corporate landlords legally use these background checks to deny future rental applications. The criminal record created by their displacement ensures they can never secure a home again. The loop is now closed. The legal and economic system is built to make a displaced individual's return to society a practical impossibility. When these disparate nodes are mapped together, they reveal a self-reinforcing cycle: real estate investment, algorithmic eviction, and the legal criminalization of the poor work in concert to protect and grow institutional capital. Ending this cycle requires structural economic disruption. We must dismantle the incentives that make homelessness profitable. First, the federal government must enforce aggressive antitrust laws against algorithmic rent collusion software to break corporate control over pricing. Second, federal legislation must tax or ban large-scale private equity firms from purchasing single-family homes, forcing properties back onto the market. Finally, federal funding must be tied strictly to permanent low-income units, ending dependency on temporary shelter management. Curing homelessness requires a direct war against the financial incentives of institutional capital, a conflict that modern politicians are currently too compromised to initiate.